Good afternoon, and welcome. Today we delve into a profoundly significant and often contentious question. Should control of ancestral lands be returned to indigenous communities? This issue is deeply rooted in historical contexts marked by dispossession and colonization, yet it resonates powerfully in contemporary discussions about justice, rights, and reconciliation. Navigating this requires careful consideration of manifold perspectives. Joining us to explore this complex terrain are two distinguished guests. Mr. Kalen Thomas, a respected Indigenous rights advocate and lawyer who argues compellingly for the restoration of control to Indigenous communities, and Dr. Samuel Adebayo, a historian and policy analyst who, while acknowledging past injustices, highlights the intricate challenges involved and explores alternative frameworks. Our discussion will begin with opening statements from each guest, followed by a moderated exchange, and conclude with brief closing remarks. Mr. Thomas, would you please begin?
Thank you, Dr. Reed. The question of returning control over ancestral lands is fundamentally a matter of justice. It concerns the rectification of profound historical wrongs, the systematic dispossession and marginalization of indigenous peoples, which constitutes a clear violation of fundamental human rights recognized under international law. This isn't merely about property. It's about restoring dignity, acknowledging inherent rights, and enabling genuine self-determination. For indigenous communities, the connection to ancestral lands is indivisible from identity, culture, spirituality, and sustenance. It transcends purely economic or legal definitions of ownership. These lands are the wellspring of our languages, our ceremonies, our traditional laws, and our very being as distinct peoples. To deny control over these territories is to perpetuate colonial structures that undermine our existence. Meaningful self-determination, a right affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is intrinsically linked to the ability to govern our own territories according to our own customs and priorities. Without control over land and resources, self-determination remains an abstract concept, lacking tangible substance. Furthermore, there's a compelling ecological imperative. Indigenous peoples have stewarded these lands for millennia, developing sophisticated systems of traditional ecological knowledge, or tech. This knowledge, deeply integrated with cultural practices, has proven remarkably effective in maintaining biodiversity and promoting environmental sustainability, offering invaluable lessons in an era of climate crisis. Restoring control empowers communities to apply this knowledge for the benefit of all, safeguarding critical ecosystems often threatened by conventional resource extraction models. Concerns are often raised about feasibility, about existing property rights, or about claims being too old. But these arguments frequently serve to mask a reluctance to confront the enduring legacies of injustice. Legal and logistical complexities exist, certainly, but they are not insurmountable obstacles when approached with genuine political will and a commitment to reconciliation. Innovative legal frameworks and negotiated agreements can be developed, as demonstrated in various jurisdictions globally. Justice delayed is justice denied. Therefore, the return of control over ancestral lands is not merely a symbolic gesture. It is a moral, legal, and practical necessity for achieving genuine reconciliation and building a future based on mutual respect and equity.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Dr. Adebayo, your opening statement, please.
Thank you, Dr. Reed, and thank you, Mr. Thomas, for articulating the profound significance of this issue from the perspective of Indigenous rights and justice. Let me state unequivocally at the outset, the historical injustices inflicted upon Indigenous communities, particularly regarding land dispossession, are undeniable facts of history. The legitimacy of Indigenous claims and the urgent need for redress are not in question. My intention is not to diminish these truths, but rather to introduce layers of complexity that must be carefully considered when translating the principle of redress into practical policy, specifically concerning the transfer of land control. The contemporary landscape is vastly different from the pre-colonial era. Implementing a widespread return of full control presents formidable practical, legal, and socioeconomic challenges that demand rigorous examination. Firstly, Defining the precise boundaries of quote, ancestral lands can be exceedingly complex. Historical territories often shifted, overlapped, and were subject to intricate traditional protocols. Furthermore, navigating competing claims, sometimes between different indigenous groups themselves, requires delicate and potentially protracted negotiation processes. Secondly, we must grapple with the reality of existing non-indigenous populations, infrastructure, industries, and legally established property rights within these territories. How do we balance the imperative of indigenous justice with the rights and interests of current inhabitants and economic stakeholders? A simplistic transfer of control could potentially lead to significant social disruption and economic instability if not managed with extraordinary care and foresight. Legally, the situation is often a quagmire. Existing property laws, differing treaty interpretations, or the complete absence of treaties in some regions, and constitutional frameworks present substantial hurdles. Reconciling indigenous legal orders and concepts of land tenure with established state legal systems is a monumental task, requiring innovative but also legally sound solutions. Economically, we must consider the implications. What are the potential impacts on resource development, investment, and regional economies? What mechanisms would be needed to support indigenous communities in managing these lands effectively, potentially requiring significant capacity building and financial resources? These questions aren't intended to obstruct progress, but to ensure that solutions are sustainable and equitable for everyone involved. Consequently, while affirming the need for profound redress, I question whether a universal policy of returning full, direct control is always the most effective or feasible pathway. Perhaps a more nuanced approach, sensitive to specific contexts, might ultimately better serve the goals of reconciliation and indigenous empowerment. This could involve exploring a spectrum of options, such as significantly enhanced co-management agreements that guarantee genuine power sharing, robust consultation frameworks with veto rights in certain contexts, substantial resource revenue sharing arrangements, the creation of indigenous managed land trusts, or targeted land buyback programs funded by the state. These alternatives, while perhaps falling short of full control in the absolute sense, could offer pragmatic, context-specific avenues towards restoring a measure of autonomy, economic benefit, and stewardship responsibility to indigenous communities, addressing the complexities I've outlined.
Thank you, Dr. Adebayo. You've both laid out compelling, albeit divergent, initial positions. Mr. Thomas, Dr. Adebayo raises significant practical challenges: boundary definitions, existing non-indigenous rights, legal hurdles. How do you propose these complex implementation issues be navigated without causing undue disruption or perceived injustice to others?
Dr. Reed, the complexities Dr. Adebayo highlights are genuine, but they have historically been wielded as justifications for inaction, perpetuating the status quo of dispossession. Boundary issues, while intricate, can be resolved through dedicated processes involving historical research, oral testimony, and negotiation, guided by indigenous legal traditions alongside state mechanisms. It requires resources and commitment, not dismissal. Regarding existing rights, solutions must be found. But the premise cannot be that colonial-era appropriations permanently extinguish indigenous rights. This requires innovative legal thinking, perhaps involving compensation for third parties, land swaps, or phased transitions, but the fundamental right to the land must be the starting point. We see successful models internationally. Look at treaty settlements in Canada, or land rights legislation in parts of Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. They weren't simple, but they demonstrate that political will can overcome logistical hurdles. To frame these challenges as insurmountable barriers is, frankly, to prioritize the convenience of the existing system over the demands of fundamental justice.
Dr. Adebayo, Mr. Thomas argues that practical difficulties shouldn't negate fundamental rights and points to international examples. Furthermore, he implies that alternatives like co-management might not equate to true self-determination. Could co-management frameworks genuinely satisfy the call for sovereignty and control, or do they risk perpetuating existing power imbalances?
That's a critical point, Dr. Reed. My advocacy for exploring alternatives like co-management is not intended to dilute indigenous rights, but to find viable pathways in highly complex situations. The success of co-management hinges entirely on its structure. If it involves genuine power sharing, adequate funding for indigenous partners, respect for indigenous knowledge and decision-making authority, potentially including veto power over certain developments, then it can represent a significant step forward. However, I concede that poorly designed consultation or co-management can indeed be tokenistic, merely serving to legitimize decisions already made by the state or industry. Regarding international examples, while instructive, each national context is unique. The specific legal history, demographics, and political climate heavily influence what is achievable. For instance, implementing large-scale land return in densely populated areas with centuries of established non-indigenous settlement presents distinct challenges compared to remote regions. Consider also the issue of capacity. A sudden transfer of vast territories might require substantial support for governance structures, resource management expertise, and economic development initiatives within indigenous communities, which needs realistic planning and funding. My concern is ensuring that the process of redress leads to sustainable empowerment, not potentially overwhelming challenges or new conflicts.
Mr. Thomas, the notion of capacity is often raised. Is this a legitimate concern, or can it sometimes be used paternalistically to delay the restoration of rights?
It can absolutely be wielded paternalistically. The narrative that indigenous communities lack capacity ignores the fact that our capacity for self-governance and land management was systematically undermined by colonization and restrictive legislation. We possess millennia of experience in stewarding these lands. What's often lacking isn't inherent capacity, but rather the resources and freedom to exercise that capacity. Resources often controlled by the very state, raising the concern. Capacity building is important, yes, but it should occur concurrently with, or following, the restoration of control, driven by the communities themselves, not as a precondition set by external actors. Furthermore, models of indigenous governance and economic development already exist and are thriving where communities have secured greater autonomy. This isn't theoretical. It's happening now.
Let's delve deeper into the concept of control. Mr. Thomas, you advocate for full control. Dr. Adebayo, you suggest alternatives might suffice. What does control truly encompass in this context? Is it absolute ownership, jurisdictional authority, stewardship rights, veto power?
Control fundamentally means the authority for indigenous nations to make the primary decisions about the use, management, and benefit of their ancestral lands, according to their own laws, values, and aspirations. This includes jurisdictional authority, the ability to govern activities on the land to benefit economically from its resources, and crucially, the right to say no to developments that threaten cultural or ecological integrity. It doesn't necessarily preclude partnerships or agreements with others, but it firmly places the locus of decision-making power within the indigenous community. Co-management, unless it guarantees this level of authority, risks falling short.
I concur that the definition of control is pivotal. My perspective is that the degree and form of control might need to be context-dependent. In some areas, perhaps less populated, or with clear treaty rights, something closer to the full control Mr. Thomas describes might be feasible. In others, complex overlapping jurisdictions or intense existing development might necessitate models emphasizing shared authority, robust consultation with binding outcomes, or significant economic restitution in land acquisition programs. The key is that the outcome must be substantive empowerment and a fundamental shift away from the colonial power dynamic, even if the mechanism varies.
So the disagreement seems to lie partly in whether a universal approach of full control is viable versus a more tailored, potentially tiered approach. How does reconciliation fit into this? Can reconciliation truly be achieved without the full restoration Mr. Thomas advocates?
Reconciliation requires truth, justice, and healing. For indigenous peoples, justice is inextricably tied to land. Returning control is a tangible act of restitution that acknowledges past wrongs and empowers future generations. Alternative frameworks, while potentially offering some benefits, may feel like compromises that stop short of addressing the core injustice of dispossession. True reconciliation demands transformative change, not incremental adjustments that maintain underlying colonial structures.
Reconciliation is undoubtedly the goal, and land is central to it. However, reconciliation also involves building new relationships between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples based on mutual respect and understanding. My concern is that pursuing an absolutist approach to land return everywhere, without fully accounting for the complexities and potential impacts on others, could inadvertently hinder the relationship-building aspect of reconciliation by creating new grievances or intractable conflicts. Perhaps pragmatic solutions that deliver tangible benefits, restore dignity, and share power, even if not full control in every instance, can build the trust necessary for deeper reconciliation over time.
We are nearing the end of our discussion time. I will now ask each of you for a brief closing statement, beginning with Dr. Adebayo.
Thank you. To reiterate, the imperative for justice and redress for historical wrongs committed against indigenous communities regarding their lands is undeniable and must remain central. However, the path towards achieving this justice in our complex contemporary world demands careful consideration of the significant practical, legal, and social challenges involved in implementing the universal policy of returning full land control. Ignoring these complexities risks creating unworkable situations or new conflicts, potentially undermining the very goals of reconciliation we seek to achieve. Therefore, I advocate for exploring a diverse toolkit of solutions, tailored to specific contexts. This includes robust co-management, meaningful consultation, resource revenue sharing, and land trusts. Pragmatic, power-sharing models that can foster collaboration and deliver substantive benefits as vital steps on the long road towards true reconciliation and shared prosperity.
Thank you, Dr. Adebayo. Mr. Thomas, your closing statement.
The call for the return of control over ancestral lands stems from our inherent rights as distinct peoples, rights that predate colonization and persist today. It is fundamentally about justice, self-determination, and cultural survival. The challenges involved, while significant, are not insurmountable barriers but rather logistical issues, to be resolved through genuine commitment, political will, and respect for indigenous sovereignty. To suggest that alternatives short of restored control are sufficient risks perpetuating colonial power dynamics and denying the depth of our connection to the land. Returning control is essential for healing the wounds of the past, revitalizing our cultures and languages, ensuring ecological balance through our traditional knowledge, and building a truly equitable future where indigenous nations can flourish on their own terms, on their own lands. Anything less falls short of justice.
Thank you both, Mr. Thomas and Dr. Adebayo, for sharing your insightful and deeply considered perspectives on this critical issue. You've clearly articulated the core tension, the powerful, rights-based call for the return of control grounded in historical justice and self-determination, set against the pragmatic complexities of implementation in the modern world and the potential viability of alternative or collaborative frameworks. It's evident that this conversation is multifaceted, demanding ongoing dialogue, innovative thinking, and a profound commitment to achieving genuine reconciliation. Thank you to our audience for joining us in exploring